One of our viewers asked a kind of an unusual question. This viewer said, I have looked for info on reflected light and how to identify it in darker lights. Please, can you clarify? Well, let's reflect on that. I suspect that the problem with understanding reflected light and hearing so many people talk about reflected light has to do with the word reflected, because there are all kinds of situations in our environments, not just in nature, but wherever we are, where we see reflections of light. So I've got some examples here. Here in this one, we often see that, especially late in the afternoon. If there's a sunset, we'll see light reflecting on water. If we're in an area where there is water, you see the color and the light are reflecting there. And then on something like this, where you have a shiny object, and you'll see light reflecting on the shiny object more because it has that mirror quality. Here, I think this gets closer to perhaps what the viewer is talking about for reflected light. But in this example, you see, if you think of the tire itself, you would think of just a black tire. Well, what's happening here, the orange that we see there is not only reflected light, or light reflecting back on the tire, it's also color. So there's some orange coming from somewhere, perhaps the light's reflecting back on the tire. But when we use the term reflected light, we're talking about something a little bit more specific. That is when we use it as a technique term. We're talking about something a little bit more specific. And that is about how light reflects back onto within the shadow areas of images. And so I'm going to do just a very short little demonstration for you, just to point out the concept of reflected light and show you what we're talking about. So, to start with, I'm just going to just do just a general. Let's just play with a cylinder. The concept of a cylinder, and that would be sitting on a surface. And let's say if it says sitting on a surface, or something like that. Now, let's assume that surface is light. The background is light. So what's happening there is that even though there is a light source that's hitting this subject, and even though the light around it is in a light value, part of that's going to be in shadow, but some of this light's going to be bouncing back onto that surface. You will often see that, but often it gets ignored because people are looking just for they'll just look for just general values, or they just might be looking for the image. So just let me very briefly here throw a very rough demonstration down to show you what I'm talking about. So if we have the light, say, I'm just going to do kind of a general thing that we normally see in illustrations like this, where the light is coming from here and it's kind of throwing this right here, kind of throwing this side in shadow and this side is in light. So let's just do that. So we'll do the shadow side first. And here I have on the palette just burnt umber and white, but I've divided that into 5 values of burnt umber and white. Why? Because I want represented here for you to see values of color that would fall on the light side and values that would fall on the shadow side. And that also might help you know which value to reach for reflected light. So I'm just very quickly and generally here. So if the light's shining over here, then you might have shadow on this side, like something like this. And then we would want to gradate that area that's in shadow. So we go down into the middle value here to gradate that area that's in shadow towards the light area. Get that just a little bit more loaded, the brush just a little bit better loaded, so I can show you that. There we go. Alright, so then this would be pretty deep shadow right here. I'll get that sort of gradated over like that. I'm not going to fool with what's on the inside there because mainly what I want you to see is what I'm going to do right over here. So then rinse the brush off really, really good. Again, let's remember what's happening here. The light is shining here. And if light's shining there, then I can move over into the light area, what I would consider the not in shadow section of the palette. And anything that, what I consider the not in shadow section, I could do a complete gradation of this color, as I often do on a value line in the palette. And I would have on this side of the most middle value, the values of colors that appear in shadow. And then I would have on this side values of colors that appear not in shadow. And what I have in here is more or less the transition between shadow and not in shadow. So this may be seeming like I'm straying away from the subject, but it's all related. Alright, so let's now we're working in the what I consider not in shadow. So this would be in the area where the light is striking. Now I'm going to gradate that on over into the shadow. That's the transition area. So just gradate that over, and I'll keep pulling it over like that into what we would read as a more normal type shadow. And so we'll keep working that now. I'll go right back into this not in shadow value that we're working with. Alright, so I'll go right in here again with this not in shadow value. I'm just going to pull it right on over over onto this side right here just for the moment to keep this simple enough for me to show you that principle of reflected light. Now I will just gradate it down. Let's get that a little bit more gradated. There we go. And I'll pull the paint out and a little bit more gradation here because we need that sort of a smooth gradation so we can see. There we go. So we can see that transition between light and shadow. Now, if the light source is about right here, then the lightest part of this is going to be right here, and still not reflected light. Not what we call reflected light when we're talking about light as we read it and translate it, or as we interpret it, I should say, in painting. Okay, I sort of did a little doodly like that. Now, okay, I'm not going to fool with this part down here. I'm not going to fool with this part up here. This is just to show you the concept. So, that is simply a gradation on a rounded or a cylinder surface that shows you how we can, one way we might see the values changing as something moves out of the light source into shadow. But that's not the full story. The rest of the story is, as I said earlier, when this is in a lighter environment, this surface is a lighter white. It could be a white table. It could be any just a light value table. Even this could be darker or lighter. The light source that's causing us to see this as not in shadow here is also bouncing onto the surface. And when it bounces onto the surface, it bounces back into the shadow area, right in here. And that's what we call reflected light. So the reflected light usually appears right in the shadow area, somewhere along here. And where you see it might vary just a little bit, but you don't create that reflected light with these areas. Because we call it light doesn't mean that it's going to be as light as it is over here. So in order to make that reflected light read like reflected light, we have to move back over in the area that's between the transition and the shadow values. So I'm going to move into the transition and I'll just add a little bit of that next value down to the transition, and then let's just say right in here, we create that little bit lighter, goes back into the transition here, create that just a little bit lighter right in there. Let's put a little bit more of that light in there. it's going to be a bit lighter than the shadow area that it's in. There we go, right there. There we go. And this blends into the shadow area right there. So it's usually the reflect. You can't make rules about these things because it has to do with observation, but the reflected light that you see in shadow areas, even though it feels lighter, it's usually not that much lighter than the area of the shadow. I'm going to make this just a little bit darker around here so that can read more clearly right here. And I'll just make that a little bit darker right there. Then we'll get that gradation a little bit more. And then make that read a little bit more clearly. There we go, just by pulling it. Now the reflected light always blends into the shadow area. So that's pretty close to the kind of thing we would do to create reflected light. And it's also pretty close to what we would look at or look for when you're looking for reflected light. So it's the terminology. Let me kind of get this rounded off just a little bit. So now, my intention is not to paint the whole cylinder or anything like that, just to show you the principle of how the light bounces off the surface back into the shadow areas. You might see that same sort of thing happening on trees. Often you will, especially if a tree trunk is in an area that's being strongly lit by light, and maybe in a grassy area that's strongly lit by light, you might see bouncing back onto that tree trunk some of that light that's bouncing from the grass back in. So usually you see that the way we use the term reflected light, that's what I want to clarify. The way we use the term reflective light is to define that light in a shadow area which reflects back into the image. Hope you enjoyed this quick tip. If you have questions or a suggestion for a quick tip, leave us a comment right down here in the YouTube comment box. And take a trip over to DianeMize.com and look at all the things we have there for you, including full-length video tutorials. And while you're there, sign up for our newsletter so you'll always be informed of our latest adventures. And thanks for watching.